What's the deal with those AI flyers that so many people are using? And not just AI flyers, but billboards, yard signs, and all sorts of media and print that's getting put out there. We're going to talk about it on today's podcast and what the big deal is about why these things are getting such an outcry. Hey, my name is Blake Benz. I'm the host of the Good Advice Podcast, and you've come to the right place to learn how to do business better. There's no fluff on the podcast, just the stuff that actually works in running a successful, scalable business. Hey, before we jump into today's episode, a quick ad from one of the businesses that sponsored today's show. Check this out, and we'll be back soon.
Do you ever feel like your payment processor is robbing you blind? For some of us, it's not blind. We look at the amount of money that's going to our payment processor month after month, and a lot of times we ask ourselves, is there a better way? I'm making good money, yet so much of it isn't actually ending up in my pocket. In the world of payment processing, in many cases, it's a cashless world, so you have to have a payment processor you can really trust. I personally am a big fan of Brad Norwood, who's the owner of PrimePaymentsUSA.com. Brad's a business owner himself. He knows all the challenges that come with running a business. More importantly, he knows the value of an individual customer. See, some of these bigger businesses, they're all about scale. They're all about bringing in as many customers as possible. But do they know your name? Do they know your business? Do they know what's important to you? In many cases, the answer is no. And in worst cases, they're just looking to get as much money from every transaction that you work hard for, which really doesn't feel too good. So you got to reach out to Brad Norwood today and understand how he's doing business and why it can save you money month after month. More importantly, you might even ask him about his zero-fee payment processing that he's offering to a select few of people. Go to PrimePaymentsUSA.com and start putting the money that you worked hard for back into your pocket.
All right, so let's talk about this. This is always a fun thing to talk about because, we're living in the world of AI and all the neat and interesting things that come with it. But this is something that I have continued to see quite a bit of backlash about, and we're going to talk about it today and dig into, should you be worried about using AI content for your flyers? Is this something that, someone's going to leave you a one-star review over? Candidly, they might. People are getting feverish about the anti-AI conversation, which I'll be totally honest, I'm definitely biased towards being anti-AI just because of, my brand is so defined by just doing authentic business and genuine business. And so much of the AI slop that's out there is not genuine. It's not authentic. So I'll get that right out there from the get-go. But having said that, I do have a Claude membership and a ChatGPT membership and have found some value in using AI for parsing through data and things like that. All that to say, jumping into today's conversation, there has been a raucous crowd, talking about AI flyers. I've noticed this the other day. I've seen quite a few posts on Facebook and on LinkedIn about, I guess, from random marketers being like, hey, stop putting up your AI flyers. And I think that this is actually something to pause and talk about because I totally get where people are coming from. Now, wherever you are in your business, many people have found themselves in a position where they couldn't afford to hire a marketer. They couldn't afford to have any kind of outside help. I totally resonate with that and empathize with that. In fact, often whenever I am in a sales conversation with people, I do what I wish someone had done with me way back when I started Good Advice. I wish that someone had said, hey, Blake, dude, don't spend any money on this. You got to build up your business first. Don't spend what little cash flow you have and put yourself in a difficult position. Though I did have one person at some point a couple years in who did give me that kind of advice, and I so appreciate it. But often in my sales conversations with people, one of the first things we talk about is revenue. We talk about, how much money are you making right now? What are sales like right now? How many are you selling right now? And realistically, is it an honest, is it an honest possibility that you can peel off some of your revenue and dedicate it to monthly marketing. And for many people, they can't, especially in today's economy. It's just not a doable thing. So from the get-go, I often tell people, hey, don't spend money on this. Or I say, hey, here's how you can do it yourself. So I empathize with the person who, maybe they just discovered Canva and they're realizing, oh, there's so many cool assets and things that I can do myself. And oh my gosh, I mean, I think about some of my websites, some of our early websites, and just some of the early work. Just I cringe. I think, oh my gosh, that was so awful. That was so terrible. Even like some social media content we put out that we made, I'm like, oh, it's so ugly. It's not a good one. Um, and all that to say, you have, I guess, some of the excitement around tools like ChatGPT and what have you, is that it can suddenly be your marketer, it can be your graphic designer, and it can start to generate lots of really cool things. So, having said that, I don't think that the business owner who uses an AI flyer is necessarily taking shortcuts. I don't think that the person using this is lazy or cheap or what have you. The thing is that a lot of people who've never run a business, they don't understand the pain and challenge that comes with running a business. I've seen this myself where I've told this story so many times. I was in a group conversation at a table, and we were talking about business struggles, and someone was saying how revenue was really difficult. And the table was like, hey, you need to hire a salesperson. And he was like, well, yeah, I know, but I can't afford that. I can't do that. So like, what's my next move? And someone was like, well, that's a limiting opinion or a limiting mindset. You got to just believe that it can work. And the person was like, okay, well, I still can't afford to hire a salesperson. And they're like, no, you just got to do it. You just got to hire a salesperson. And then I jumped in and was like, squad, this is not doable for this person. They've literally said they are not even making enough money to pay themselves. And how many times in your life have you hired someone who was willing to work for free? It's not to say that there aren't plenty of sales positions out in the world that are commission only. It's not to say that there is some avenue where this person could walk down this decision and make it happen. But point being, when people have never been in a position like this, it's easy to, form an opinion on what needs to be done and what should not be done. So I empathize with the business owner who, they're realizing all the cool things that come with AI and the productivity that comes with it. That's all very well and fine. And I'm trying to ground our conversation too, and not get into the ethics of AI. And, I have plenty of opinions about that. I've shared them on a multitude of podcasts. You can check all that out if you really want to deep dive on it. Not get on the soapbox today. But I do want to warn people who are overly using the AI flyer and part of your creative process. And this conversation reminds me of whenever we started Podcastable a few years ago, which we were doing podcast editing and production for people's podcasts. And then it was like, man, we really need to roll this out as its own thing. And so I launched Podcastable, and I had this great customer. We did a lot of podcast content for them. And then it came around where they said, hey, we want to use one of these AI tools to edit our podcasts and then use you for like some of the more nuanced or niche clips or what have you. So we had this conversation, and the thing about Opus AI or Opus Clips, which is like, at the time, it was like one of the most giga popular podcast editing tools out there. Now there's quite a few other ones. I don't know if Opus is still like the main one or not. But point being, I think Opus was like $30 a month or something. And then we were editing podcasts for something like $400 per episode. So I'm not like surprised by someone like looking over at Opus being like, well, geez, this is a one-time fee per month versus $400 per episode. Like the difference is pretty staggering, which, by the way, if you go out and you try to hire a company to edit your podcast, $400 is pretty cheap. It's about what you'd pay. In fact, it's on the lower end of what you'd pay. The reason for this, and again, not getting like super in the weeds, I'm like, well, what do you even get from that? There's just those of you who've used AI for something versus hired an actual human, you've known the difference in quality. Or maybe you've even had a customer of your own who's come to you about AI versus what you can do, and you've known the difference in quality. Despite that, regardless of that, what has happened now is that customers are starting to notice the difference in quality. So continuing with this story, we pulled up some Opus clips. And I had this conversation actually a few times with just different customers over the last couple of years. And so I already had some things ready for this conversation. It never really bothers me, by the way, when a customer is looking at competitors or looking at other options. It doesn't make me uncomfortable. It doesn't worry me. It doesn't get me panicked or offended. Ultimately, my customers' loyalty to me is about as powerful as what I've done to earn it. And I've never really felt like I deserve anyone's business. And more importantly, I think the second part about doing good business is just being a great advisor and telling someone, yeah, let's look at Opus. Let's see if that's a better option for you. And being genuine in that, I have just found that long term, it just builds so much more trust and actually develops fans of your business that are far more loyal than they would have been otherwise. So we look at this, and in looking at Opus, we pull up a handful of clips, and we're just kind of going through things, and customers saying, oh yeah, we could do something like that. Here's a clip where, it's going back and forth, and what have you, between like the guest and like the host, and all those things. And the customer, we go through a few of them. I'm like, yeah, this is pretty good, and I'm not like bashing it. I have quite a few opinions about it. But we're just kind of going through a few, and then I say, yeah, so which ones do you like? Like, is there something that they do well here that you'd want us to do? And the customer says, yeah, they kind of all look kind of the same. And I said, yeah, they do. And he says, yeah, I mean, it's like the same cuts, and it just looks very similar. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's an algorithm. It's applying an algorithm across a few different podcasts, and yeah, the font face is the same, the style is the same. It all kind of looks the same despite them all being different podcasts. And it led to this conversation where it was like, so why do you pay for Podcastable? Why are you paying for this other company rather than doing like this $30 a month membership? And I said, well, let's look at, one of your recent episodes. So we pulled it up, and we looked at like the color grading and how visually the podcast just insanely popped versus the natural camera coloring. I could not think of the words to use there for a second. But we were looking at like the actual original footage, and we looked at like the actual color graded one. And I personally think that great color grading, unless you're doing color grading normally, I personally think that good color grading, you really shouldn't notice that it's color graded. The thing about this, by the way, is like how Hollywood movies, like Mexico is always tinted yellow, and it's like there's sometimes it's so overdone that you're just like, what's going on here? What's happening here? And so all that to say, I don't think that, color grading is essential. But sorry, I thought I heard my kids yelling. All that to say, we looked at it and I said, yeah, I mean, it's color graded. It pops. Great. Okay, let's look at some of these clips. And then we were looking at the Opus one, and it was like, oh, the Opus like kind of missed the punchline. And I was like, yeah, so like, do you think you're going to go in and like edit that and revise that and what have you? And he was like, I don't think I really want to. And I was like, Okay, so you're seeing the value here. Point being, though, one, I think it's valuable just to talk to your customers. Talk to your customers and have these kinds of conversations with them and not get uncomfortable with your customers. I mean, I had a conversation with someone where they were looking to buy a website. And in the conversation, they said, well, what's it going to cost just to like do it myself? And I said, well, I mean, it's your time. Like, how much do you know about this stuff? And I said, well, I don't really know anything about this stuff. So I said, well, it's probably going to take a lot more time than you expect. But having these kinds of conversations, I think, are just really valuable. But separately, helping your customer understand, like, what's the outcome? What's the goal? What are you trying to accomplish here? Right. And this is mostly like from a marketing perspective. But let's say you, as the business owner, you're thinking about, how do I really make more money? The question you have to ask yourself is, am I trying to create a a create like a first steps of a brand to get out there? Like, no one knows me. I don't have any money coming in. Nothing's happening. I would say go the AI flyer route. But if you're genuinely trying to make a name for yourself of like quality and, we do a good job and we know our business, why would you settle with something like an AI flyer? And this is someone, by the way, who we don't do any creative work. We don't do any branding work. We don't do any design work. But why would you settle with something like that? Because ask yourself something. If you look just like everybody else, how does your customer see you? If everybody's using these AI flyers and using this AI generated content, what are people going to think about you? One of the things that came up on the podcast, this was years ago, I had someone on the show probably about 4 or 5 years ago talking about the problem with the hotel industry and how the hotel industry had really floundered and failed. And one of the things that we talked about was that every hotel experience is exactly the same. This was also, by the way, when like Airbnb was like getting so much traction. And, now funny enough, people are kind of going back to hotels because of like cleaning fees and all the things that come with making Airbnbs very difficult. But we were talking about like why had Airbnb and VRBO and these other places taken so much business from hotels? Well, when you look at a hotel, what really makes it special? You have the continental breakfast that everyone has. It's the powdered soggy eggs, and it's the same toast and jellies and jams and cantaloupe set out. I mean, it's about as cheap as you can get, right? I think one time I was at a hotel and they had a waffle maker, which I was all about. I was like, okay, now we're living large. We're making this happen, right? But it's just funny to me. I mean, you look at hotels and it's like, yeah, they're all pretty much the same. In fact, a lot of them really aren't even that clean. They're not even really, in many cases, not even really that nice. With exception, there's been a few that I've stayed at that I've been like, okay, this was a great experience. But the point that I was talking to with this person on the podcast was, he said, the issue is that every hotel experience is just like one another. They're all the same. And the problem with that is that when competitors or when a customer's making a buying decision and all of the choices look the same, what do they most often cling to? Do you know? It's price. Think about it. You're at the grocery store or you're at the electronics store buying a TV or, I don't know what you're getting. You're buying something and everything looks the same. I mean, when the products are all the same, you're going to look at the dollar sign. You're going to look at the price tag. So what ends up happening then in like the hotel industry is all these hotels are similar experiences and they're all fighting over the cheapest price. And this is a race to the bottom. The same thing is true for your business. Do you really want to be known for having the cheapest price? This is something that I think newer business owners really struggle with, in the sense of They're wanting to grow their brand. They're wanting to grow their business. They think that a cheap price is what creates accessibility. It's what creates greater interest in your business. But what it actually does is it does the opposite. It causes people to pass you over. Why? Because they don't think that you must have quality in your brand. Otherwise, why is it so cheap? Why is it so expensive? See, as much as people like to talk about wanting things to not wanting to pay for like a certain thing. This is separate, by the way, from like the affordability crisis. I'm not talking about that. But people on one hand would want things to be so inexpensive, but on the same token, what do people value? What they're willing to pay for. There is a subreddit. I haven't been to it in forever, but I think it's called Buy It for Life or something like that. I think this is actually the wrong example, but I've seen social media posts about something you spent a lot of money on that you've never regretted. And you could probably think about something for yourself too. Maybe like a really nice coffee maker, just something you splurged on and you're so glad you did it because the quality of it is so freaking good. See, we value what we pay for. And on the same token, you can probably remember a time that you skimped out on price and something broke or the quality was crap. So you had to buy it again, and you had to buy it a third time. And then you finally ponied up the money and bought the one that was actually expensive. And then you thought, oh, this is why it costs this amount. This is why it is valued at this dollar amount. We've all learned that lesson. The same thing's true for your business. You don't want to be the cheapest one. It amazes me the number of times that people offer free services, or the worst offender I've seen of this is pay what you can, where someone has like an actual business and they say, yeah, just pay what you can, pay what you're willing. And it doesn't cause people to show up in troves. Instead, it repulses people. Repulses is like such a strong word. It causes people to look you over because you don't charge anything for it. So they're not going to value it. And so point being, you don't want to be the cheapest price. And with that, if you look like everybody else and people think you're like everybody else and they don't see any differences and they don't see why you're special, then they're going to expect to look at your dollar amount. They're going to expect, or you should expect, that they're going to look at your price. And it's a race to the bottom from there. Just like what happened with the hotel industry of the past 10 to 15 years, the same thing is true for businesses today that cannot differentiate themselves. And you got to differentiate yourself in a way that makes sense, by the way. I had another guest on the podcast years ago who talked about being different has to matter. It has to make sense. He said, you can show up at a business meeting wearing a clown outfit, and that's different, but it's not different in a way that makes someone want to buy from you. So different has to make sense. A good example of this, I think they're out of business. I don't think it worked out, but there was a web design company that they charged $50 a month to build a website and maintain your website. And there was no upfront cost. It was just $50, which, by the way, you'd have to keep a customer for a year for this to make sense money-wise. But in having a conversation with the owner, it was like, why do you all do it this way? And he's like, we just do it a different way. Now, granted, I don't think they lasted, but I appreciate, they were doing something different. They were trying something different. Think about what you offer, what you sell that cuts against the grain of what people expect in a way that benefits them, that makes them genuinely appreciate you more. That's different. That is different. That matters. That's what you should be known for. That's the kind of thing you should talk about when you talk about your brand or advertise or what have you. So again, if you're new to the game, you can't afford creating some of this stuff. Is an AI flyer the worst thing you can do? Probably not. But if you're expecting it to move the needle, or worse, you've spent hundreds of dollars printing off this kind of stuff. You've spent thousands, worse, you spent thousands on a marketing company that has generated this kind of AI content for you. You're in deep trouble. Because not only are you spending all this money that could have gone to actual quality, you're putting out a bunch of slop that's not going to go anywhere. And you would think marketing companies wouldn't do that. But trust me, I've been in the game for almost a decade. I've seen it all. And it would surprise you, or maybe it wouldn't, the things people try to get away with. Hey, thanks for listening to today's podcast episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, feel free to subscribe to the show if you're not already. And don't forget, you can always support the podcast on our Patreon, patreon.com/goodadvice. And a big shout out to all the people who support the podcast there. Hey, thanks for listening today. That's today's Good Advice. We'll catch you later. See ya.